expression of typical characters that you find in this text, and of typical kinds of stories and typical kinds of context, right? And one of the first things that I would like to talk about is the issue of citizenship. But you have to, the first thing that I would like to mention, because I didn't get to mention it, is that African countries started getting their independence. Or, all of these expressions are kind of problematic, like, getting independence, being granted independence, right? Or evolving into independence. Like, all of these, euphemistic things are actually very, very problematic. But anyway, let's not get into that, because that's take us into things that we don't have time for. So anyway, starting in 1957, starting with Gold Coast, that is the country that is known today as Ghana, right? African countries started getting their independence. The bulk of them, most of them, got their independence in the 1960s. Between 1960 and 1967, 1968, the majority of them did get their independence under conditions that were totally variable and different. In other words, what I'm saying is that whether it is for the British, or whether it is with the British or with the French, there is, and there never was, a unique, uniform way of quote-unquote granting independence. It was always something that was context-driven, right? Dependent, very much dependent on the forces in presence, the kinds of pressures that these nationalists were able, in fact, to exert on the French administration or the British administration. And depending also on the kind of support that they were able to garner, right, in their own country. So this is saying. So started getting their independence in 1967, and in fact, the last country to get its independence was South Africa in 1994. I don't know if that is independent, but anyway, it was the end of apartheid, right? With the end apartheid being defined in this context as, again, some kind of colonial domination system, right? Based on grabbing the land, based on excluding, based on usurpation, and so on and so forth, right? So that system, I'm not saying that the practice has ended, yes, but I'm saying that the system, in fact, has officially ended in 1994. That was the last time that somebody got there. And these infantrymen, Senegalese infantrymen, whom we talked about, who actually, most of them had absolutely nothing to do with Senegal. But it just happened that, well, it was a way of referring to them. They, at the end of the war, right, they started sort of spreading the discourse of the necessity to take hold of your own life, to be able to rule this country, in fact, ourselves, and not letting other people to do that. So there was a whole discourse about courage, there was a whole discourse about the necessity, right, to subject oneself to sacrifices. And there was a whole discourse, also a whole celebration about heroes of resistance. So in every single country, Francophone African country that you go to, you will find a list of names of people who had been either killed or had been, imprisoned, or who somehow, who have had their lives totally upset because of their, because of their political activities during that period. And I can quote a couple. In the Congo, there's a case of Lumumba in the Congo. Hopefully we will get to show a film about Lumumba, but I don't know, right? In the case of Cameroon, there's Ruben, there's another one called Bouvier. And in the case of Senegal, there is Cheikh Anta Diop, who was a very well-known, in fact, Egyptologist, right? And also there's the name of Mamadou Dia, who really was a cultural nationalist, cultural and religious nationalist, and who because of his political activities, and something up to 25 years after being in prison, he was freed at the end of his life, and he was dead within 10 years of being freed from prison. So, what you can say is that if you look at the history of these countries, there was no shortage of heroism. There was no shortage of sacrifices. There was no shortage, in fact, of, there is right now no shortage of celebrating people whose resistance, is still celebrated, in fact, in these various countries. I mention this because in a country, for example, like Cameroon, this character of Ruben, who organized a whole population against colonial domination, has been the topic of a novel. There's a novel called Remember Ruben, right? And that novel talks about these various characters. But within that period also, because we have to mention this, because this again has an impact on the literary evolution of these Francophone countries. There has been, during the nationalist struggle, a lot of participation by women. In Algeria, for example, right, we do know that during the War of Independence, of Algeria, like these women who have their veils and so on and so forth, we don't touch their bodies, right? So, what they did, but some of these nationalist women, what they did was that they were actually ferrying weapons from one camp to another by putting these weapons under their guards, right? The French would not touch them. The French knew that you don't touch the body of these. It was simply like a sacrilege to do these kind of things. And a lot of these, not only that, but also they transmitted messages from one camp to another. So they greatly participated in a country like Senegal, in a country like Ivory Coast. There were a whole group of women who early on in the 1950s started organizing and started agitating. Women, really women, nothing but women in that group, and started agitating, for independence, right? Of course, some of them were pulled out of the group by their husbands, because the husbands say, well, you choose, eh? You say this or and so on and so forth. But there is, this history now exists. In fact, there is a documentary that was made a couple of years ago, on the legacy of these women. I mention this because if you look at, North African literature, or even if you look at West African Francophone literature, you would find, in fact, in some of the texts, there is in North Africa this writer who died not even 10 years ago, Asia Diaba. Her name is Diaba, and she was from Algeria. She was from Algeria, and she wrote this novel called L'amour, la fantasia, right? Which is translated into English as Fantasia, right? Not the easiest work actually to read and understand, because this is not a book that, is like story from A to Z, It's very creative and it's very poetic, in which she evokes the participation of these women into this struggle. She also wrote another book called actually a collection of short stories called Femmes d'Alger dans leur appartement. Right? Femmes d'Alger dans leur appartement. And Women of Algiers, I think. En anglais, c'est Women of Algiers. And then in some of those short stories, she shows how during the War of Independence, a group of women organized and settled at the frontier between Tunisia and Algeria, and were in that borderland, right, had the mobility and had the ability, in fact, to move from one camp to the next with all kinds of messages and all kinds of weapons and so on. So, why am I suggesting this? Well, of course, you have to acknowledge, right, the participation of these women, because in fact, institutionally speaking, once the man got into power, what they were most interested was to, in fact, look after their own interests, right, and not particularly look after the interests of women. But, I'm suggesting this because there are films and there are novels, in fact, who create this very larger-than-life type of female character who not only have participated in the freedom of the country, but who, again, through the literature, are criticizing heavily, in fact, the way in which the men are running the country. And actually telling them that you guys have failed us, you have failed our hopes, you have failed our dreams, and you should get off and let us run the country now. And those kinds of texts do exist, and that is going to be, in fact, one of such texts that we are going to look at. The last text, I believe, was the text of Calix Béala, C'est le soleil qui m'a brûlé. Oui? Well, he doesn't really do that, but you can relate it. You can relate it. Oh, okay. No, so but overall, when we get to the end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s, the general atmosphere in most of these countries who had become independent in the 1960s is disillusionment. Right? People are disillusioned. People thought that independence would bring them at least conditions of living that would be better, far better, than they were able to have, with the French colonials. They thought that, right, mortality rates, for example, like baby mortality rate, for example, would decrease. They thought that diseases also would decrease. They thought that because these politicians who were fighting for the independence had actually made so many speeches about them, they thought that, there would be opportunity for all. There would be clean running water, right? There would be decent places. There would be hospitals and so on and so forth, that they would be able to send the children, in fact, to school, right? And when we get to the end of the 1970s, early 1980s, things started getting a little bit more complicated. Because this is a period where, in most African countries, these local governments started experiencing economic difficulties. And with these economic difficulties, the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, IMF, and so on and so forth, got involved. And once they got involved, right, one of the first things they told them is that all of these social programs, forget it. Okay? Because they are too expensive. You have to promote private sector and promote private business and so on and so forth. So, all of a sudden, even these very timid tentatives that were being made by these nationalist government to improve the welfare of the population, this became a liability for the government. Right? Because they could not, one of the conditions for them to obtain money and loans from these Bretton Woods institutions were that you had to tone down these things. You had to allow for more private things, private schools, private universities, and so on and so forth. So, the atmosphere then, throughout the country, throughout these various countries, when we get to the 1980s, is a feeling of dashed hopes and a feeling of latent conflict. Latent conflict not only between the people who live in the cities and the people who live in the countryside, the people who have and the people who have not, right? But also latent conflict between men and women. And it so happens that the end of the 1970s and the early 1980s is going to start to see, right, the coming on scene of women writers. Right? Well, you're going to ask me, well, these men have been writing since the 1960s. Like, how come women were not writing in the 1960s? There was a 10 to 15 years gap. Okay? Simply because men went to school earlier than women. Because the families, when they had a choice as to who to send to school, they would send their sons rather than the daughters. So it is that gap there that is reflected, in fact, in this idea of women coming on scene only in the 1980s. At a time of conflict, at a time, in fact, where there is great tension in the country as to the sort of the division of labor, as to the division of whatever riches exist in the country, and written by women that we will do, okay, you will find a lot of poems that, address this issue frontally. Right? Because these are mostly written by these Francophone African women, and address this issue and actually simply state that men, in fact, nationalist men have failed. So therefore, there is an opportunity and a space for women actually to become agents of change. So, the end result is that when we get to the 1970s, to the end of the 1970s, it becomes obvious, in fact, to most people, right, that in fact, the end of colonialism, the advent of independence, right, has not brought about, and certainly does not mean the end of colonialism. If, in fact, colonialism is simply a system of domination, right? I mean, you can kind of take away the most egregious kind of effect of colonialism, but, in fact, still maintain the ownership of the land, the ownership of factories, the ownership of institutions, right, by foreigners. These foreigners, because of their economic clout, right, end up having a lot of political clout in the country. Which means, in turn, that in fact, the population still remains kind of marginalized. And that realization, okay, is going to generate a resentment, is going to generate, in fact, a lot of disappointment, and also is going to generate a whole list of texts, right, that are going to come out of those types of experiences. The image of the returning students comes back, but now he is in power. Now he wants to protect his power. Now he has the police behind him. Now he can be very violent against, any protest or anything that is going to oppose, in fact, his mostly, in fact, policies. The idea of the post-colonial state, right, as an entity that has inherited, directly inherited, right, violence as a form of management of protest in the country, right, that is going to be extremely prominent in all of these novels that will start getting published at the end of the 1970s and beginnings of the 1980s. And even though, in fact, this short story that we are going to see this afternoon was created in the 1960s, it still inches, right? It inches towards this kind of prevalent violence in the country because of this gap between the hopes that had been raised and the reality, in fact, which most people feel as something that is disappointing. So we start having an elite. But an elite that is very prone to reproducing itself, right? As as a way of protecting itself. If you reproduce, if you promote your own, you know exactly that you won't have any surprises. And in order to do that, you have to set up a system that would exclude any kind of, unexpected people and unexpected stuff, in fact, happening. This is why today, right? If you read, for example, some of the sociological analysis that have been done on these post-colonial countries, one of the issues that comes up very, very often, two issues that will come up, is the issue of violence, right? Is the issue of a sense of entitlement, yes? And it is an issue of what one French political scientist has called la politique du ventre, right? The politics of the belly. But you have to understand the belly here as, a little more than stomach, that is without part of it. Politics of the belly is making sure that whatever resources happen in the country are channeled towards your own pleasure, not towards the well-being of anybody else, but towards, of course, that raises issues like corruption, right? Exclusion, right? And of course, in order to be able to exclude all those people, you have to create a repressive system in such a way that, the borders become extremely rigid and extremely firm. So you have novels like what? You have novels like, there's a man from Congo who wrote this novel called La Vie et Denis. And his name is Laboutancy, Sony Laboutancy. Sony. We will not do any of those novels, but if you have an opportunity to read La Vie et Denis, it's one of the classics, in fact, of Francophone African literature, where he creates this monstrous kind of leader of the country who thinks of nothing but his own pleasure, and who is actually prepared to do, violence to anybody in order to maintain his own pleasure. But written in a style that is absolutely exuberant, right? With gradation, with, the changes of the images of, that you find in standard French. So, this then is what is going on here, right? And this is going on, right, in countries where French is the official language, but, right, with less than 50% of the population being able to function in French. However, the constitution of the country, that is what defines, in fact, what you can and cannot do as a citizen, is written in French. In other words, the very document, in fact, right, that guarantees your right, you don't have access. You don't have access to. And again, this issue is going to come up this afternoon in this novel that we will be doing. So, given this situation, the question remains then, right? What type of French, if these writers are going to write in French, what kind of French are they going to write in? Are they going to even try to modify this language so that it is at least conceptually, right, attempted to reflect some of the values and some of the ways of doing that exist in fact in the context. And in order to understand that, I have actually come back here to India, because this issue here, right, was first raised, right, in the colonial world by this writer, Rao. And I believe that in 1938, he wrote a novel called Kantapura. Yes? Okay. And when Kantapura was published, you know, it's a novel, right? I mean, it does not break any of the grammatical rules of English. But you read it, it's not the way that English people use English.
It's a translation.
Sorry?
It's like the idea that he wrote in English.
Yeah.
It's like the translation of the Indian reality.
That's right. So, okay. Let's do a little bit of linguistics. Right? Let's do a little bit of linguistics. In linguistics, you have phonology, you have morphology, you have semantics. Right? And then you have syntax also. So, this novel is totally respectful of the English syntax. It obeys the English syntax. It obeys the English morphology. Yes? Plurals go where they should go, like, you know, tenses go where they should go, and so on and so forth. What the novel does not do, the novel deconstructs the semantics of standard English. And by deconstructing it, what the novel does is the novel introduces, right, instead of the standard English way of creating images, it substitutes the way Indian people create these images. Yes? So, translation, yes, right? But you have to say it's partial translation. Because total translation does not do that. Total translation would be totally British. Yes? It's partial translation of. And even then, I mean, you gotta be careful because, you know, it's translation with creativity. Yes? Okay, so it's not 100% total partial translation. Yes? And when Roger Rao produced that thing, right, the critics slashed him. You know, somebody wrote, okay, this novel is obviously the product of a mind that wallows in mud. Right? Another person says, well, we're not so sure that even this guy actually, you know, understands English. The point is that, you see, those kinds of transformations, those kinds of changes, you cannot do unless you know English very well. Right? You have to know what you're doing. Like, you cannot do anything because you have to know the limits of your freedom. Right? Language, okay, is extremely rigid when it comes to these, like, grammar, syntax, and morphology. Like, if you make a syntax mistake, people say, oh, he doesn't know the language. Or she does not like it. Right? So the only area where you can actually go in and make all kinds of changes is in the semantics, because there is nothing fixed, in fact, in the semantics of the language. That's what he did. He did that in the 1938. 1958, 20 years later, an African writer from Nigeria, Chinua Achebe, did exactly the same thing for his novel Things Fall Apart. He did exactly the same. Phonology, yes. Syntax, yes. Morphology, yes. But semantics, yeah. We are going to change the semantics. So he changed the images. He put in proverbs, right? He put in metaphors that never existed, in fact. And Achebe was being attacked. Achebe's answer was the price. He said, the price that the English language has to pay as a world language is its ability, its preparedness to adapt itself to as many contexts as possible. And there was, from then on, people started doing research on Indian English, like Nigerian English, and there's this professor in, I believe that he's in Pennsylvania somewhere, who has made a whole career. Actually, I think he's Indian or Pakistani, I don't know. His name is Braj Kachru, and he has all kinds of publications of Indian English and so on and so forth, and the phonology and the semantics and so on and so forth. You will notice that, okay? So far, right, all of my examples are from the English world. And this is so because the Francophones are latecomers to this game. Right? And you have to ask why. It is a legitimate question to ask why and to try to understand why. And the thing here is, okay, is that starting in the 19th century, when France started colonizing, okay, these African countries, the French devised a policy of assimilation. And in this policy of assimilation, what they were interested in, the end result, the outcome of the policy of assimilation was that they were going to create French citizens out of these African colonials. How would they do that? By setting up institutions in the colonies that would match the institutions of the French Republic. Democracy, justice, the way of life, like, this very French way of being extremely restrained, right? And of speaking in very abstract terms, right? And also, above all, the French language, the competence in the French language. So what I'm saying is that, okay, if you went to school in the 1950s in Francophone Africa, right, you would be taught that the ideal is to use this French language the same way that it is used in Paris, or not in the south of France, but in Paris and in other places. Okay? And even in Paris, you go to some parts of Paris, the way they speak French, there's nothing uniform. But anyway, that was the ideal. Okay? You had to use it that way. You had to use the grammar correctly. And also, you had to use also the semantics extremely correctly, which produces some very funny situations. Like you would go to France for the first time, okay? And as soon as you open your mouth, the French people will tell you, you speak like a book. Right? They'll start telling you, I mean, because you were like involved from very early forms. You were involved, in fact, in written text. You memorize written text. And you use the vocabulary and the language of written text, because outside school, there's nobody who uses the informal varieties of French. Right? So there was a celebration, and there was a very tight ascription to this formal language of French. So, anyway, people started writing, and of course they started writing in this. And there happened to be one writer in particular, right, who not only wrote poems and essays and so on and so forth, but who actually publicly advocated that. He advocated that, in fact, the best language that could be used by an African writer is French. Is French the way it was, like semantically tight like that, okay? And that writer is Leopold Senghor, right? Who was, for some years he was the president of Senegal, and after he retired, for a number of years he was member of the French Academy. He was also, in the 1950s, one of the most articulate, in fact, promoters of negritude with Aimé Césaire, and so on and so forth. And Senghor thought that, in fact, French is the ideal language, because French has a canon. It has a literary canon. It can express all kinds of feelings. It has been enriched by its Greek and Latin heritage. Right? It has been used by generations and generations of people. That French also, the vocabulary of French is extremely rich, because it has a combination of concrete and abstract terms, which allow, in fact, a writer to construct all kinds of metaphor, all kinds of images, and so on and so forth. He also argued that, the French language itself is extremely logical, right? Not only is it extremely logical, but it is extremely human, because in French, right, whatever you do, if you make a sentence, usually the first thing that comes in the sentence is the human being, je, tu, and so on and so forth, the subject of it. So he said that there is an emphasis on, right, on valuing, in fact, the human beings. In opposition to that, he argued, I've given you the article, in fact, right? I've given you the article in the bibliography that you will receive at the end of the day today. He also, on the other side, right, he argued that African languages are not only oral, right, but they are languages which are more adept at expressing emotions and passions rather than reason, right? And he said because of that, right, right, this issue of whether to use African languages in writings and so on and so forth is totally useless for him. I mean, for him, he had found, in fact, the ideal language. And that language, in fact, was French. And of course, other writers are going to intervene, are going to pitch into this debate with opposing views. And one of these opposing views was this writer, this Senegalese writer and filmmaker Ousmane Sembele, right? Who simply said, okay, for us, okay, the French language is like un gendarme à cheval, right? So, ready to clobber you, right? Ready to run you over, and ready to cheat you, right? Because this gendarme is corrupt, ready to cheat from you, to rob from you, to steal from you, and so on and so forth. And this is a language also that he said, okay, this is a language that systematically disadvantages and exploits the lower classes. That is, those people who cannot in fact master it, who have not had the opportunity in fact to master it. So in fact, what Sembele does in his writing, he does the same thing that Rajawawa has done. He does the same thing that Chinua Achebe has done. That is this, semantic integration, okay, of the context, of the creativity, right, of African languages. He introduces that in his novels, and I hope to be able to show you some of those things like this afternoon. And this position of Sembele, right, has kind of spread so that today it is no longer, in fact, there is no longer this debate as to whether we should modify or not modify. They systematically do it. And among the writers who systematically do it is, this writer that I just mentioned, Soni Labutansi, he actually breaks every single value of the semantic features of standard French and creates something and puts something else instead. So that when you read him, when you read the prose of this writer, okay, you very often have to stop and think about, in fact, what the possible references of these images are that he's creating, in fact, are. And it's very like exuberant and really kind of very exaggerated images, that exuberance, a kind of exuberance of the language that he creates. Maybe if I do find the book, maybe I'll bring you a page and you will have a look. Another writer who today is very adept at doing this, linguistic transformation is this writer called Alain Mabang. Right? And I give you again the name and I give you a couple of titles also. Right? And Alain Mabang does the same thing. What he does is that he uses the same type of language, the same type of language variety in French that people use in the streets of Congo. Right? that people use, in fact, very image kind of way of speaking that people use in Congolese cities. These novels are very urban ones. They have very urban settings, yes, and in spaces, and they are invested. The characters also are invested in specific places of the space. Like he has this novel in which, for example, the character is sitting on a stool in a bar and just talks. Like talks about his experiences, talks about the way that he perceived the country, talks about things that happened around him, and so on and so forth. The novel is called Verre Cassé. His glass is broken because he can't drink anymore. Right? So, today, right, the prevalent literary style of creation in terms of language is this ability, in fact, to break, to modify the semanticity, right? The semanticity of the French language. We're just going to conclude, right? Okay. What does this all mean? Right? What does this prevalent kind of different use of French language, what does it mean? Like, how can we understand it? The way I understand it is this way. Is that French, as far as these African writers is concerned, may be a language, probably is a language, right, that was created in France. Yes? That was, just like any language, created in France for the purposes of communication and any kind of communication. But from the perspective of these writers, the fact that it was created in France does not mean that it is the exclusive property of the French. That they have just as much a right to go into the language, to change it, to modify it for their own purposes as anybody else. Right? If that is what Francophone means, right, then we find ourselves in a situation where, okay, we can define Francophone literature, right, as a literature, as a literary creation that ensures the diversity of creation and the diversity of approaches. It would be very unfortunate to conceive of this Francophone literature or Francophone writing as such as an attempt to emulate what is happening in France. It has to be, I believe, that we have to adopt the position that Achebe had, is that if this language wants to define itself as a world language, it has to be able to subject or to allow, these modifications that these African writers are exerting on this language. Thank you. Yes.
So would we have to keep in mind that while the Francophone culture celebrates this diversity, that French do not just belong to the Hexagon, but it belongs to everybody who can speak French. We have to understand that French language is itself very centralized, because this is the language of those people who don't like variety. I mean, throughout the French history, we see that they were anti-diversity people. all together. And that's what I'm thinking, like how to make a language of those people truly diverse, truly acceptable to diversity.
Look, I agree with you that diversity is a big problem in France, and there is a fundamental contradiction that I see in French society. Like, no European country, okay, has colonized as many people as France has, and no European country has gone to the extent that they have gone to exclude those people. Right? Okay. If you have, for example, there are countries where, in fact, these diverse people coming from various are, in fact, integrated in the fabric of the society. This diversity seems to be a threat, in fact, to the institutions in fact. That is politically, that is what is going on, right? But I believe that the writers themselves, these African writers themselves, when they are in private with this language, perhaps they have this thing at the back of their mind. Perhaps also this is what let's say motivates them, right? To show that, you know, the language in itself as a tool, right, is not rigid. It is open to these types of modifications. Like, you know, the rigidity comes with the people, but in fact not with the language, right? Whether that is understood by the people is a different question. But it is a serious problem. Well, no, I mean, the question is, as far as independence is concerned, what was the role of ethnic groups, of the various ethnic groups, and what was the role of the French? Well, obviously, the French side is easier to answer because the French side was the opposing side. After independence? Well, after independence, in fact, the French wanted to ensure that their influence in that country would not be wasted. So, they made sure that there was in the new laws that were adopted, enough provision that would allow for the installation of French businesses, of French schools, and so on and so forth. So that after independence, you're going to see a lot of what they call bilateral agreements, yes, between France, French institutions, and France itself, right? Wanting very much to preserve, in fact, their influence, right, on a world scale, right? In these African countries, they were very keen on funding a lot of things, one of which, like education, for example. They funded a lot of African students. This is one of the reasons why you go to France and you see all of these Africans who are there and so on and so forth, right? Ethnic groups, that's a more difficult question because these ethnic groups, they came also with their own allegiances. And sometimes those allegiances would differ from the allegiances of the nation. And they would even clash. So that sometimes, right, there is a struggle, in fact, between the national allegiance and also the ethnic allegiances. And most African countries, in fact, have not yet been able to eradicate this thing, right? To eradicate this, the fact that once in a while there is some strife that erupts because one ethnic group feels that they have been slighted in some way or another, or they feel that they are not represented enough, right, in the running of the country. When you have a country in which the resources are scarce, okay, where there is also corruption, right, where you don't have well-established rules to delegate or to distribute these, right? Well, everybody is going to try to get in, and once they get in, they don't want to get out, right? And this is a site, this is a reason, this is the object for a lot of this conflict that erupts in these countries. When we get to the Rwanda thing, then I will give a little bit more detail, because that is, that conflict there can be directly linked to the colonial history of the country. Yes?
I'm wondering about the concept of the issue in the growing just in cultural production Francophone Sub-Saharan Africa, especially if we compare Francophone Sub-Saharan Africa with Anglophone Sub-Saharan Africa, because this concept is not present there. And I remember Soinka criticizing Senghor and saying something to the effect that a tiger does not have to celebrate his tigerness. A tiger knows that he is a tiger. So why have concept like?
Well, okay. There is in the 1970s actually that concept of negritude because of the prominence of Senghor. Because Senghor was president. Because Senghor was, had been promoted and presented all over the continent as, the quintessential, in fact, African intellectual, who had come straight out of, the best schools in France, and who is very articulate, who is very learned, and so on and so forth. Because of this influence, there was there were a lot of texts, in fact, that were coming out in the vein of negritude, that is celebrating African authenticity, right? Celebrating like African identities, defined, right, as a set of values that had not been tarnished in the West, right? So there was a lot of that, but all of that has kind of disappeared with the realization that with the introduction of modernity, this society had very much integrated a lot of things that have come from the West, in fact. So today, nobody talks about negritude anymore. But it is possible to think that negritude, okay, has brought into the creation of this literary text, like at least an understanding of what it is in fact to be African. But this understanding today is pretty much like modified. It is informed by all kinds of different varieties of identity, different ways, different modes of being that are relevant, in particular in the cities of the continent, that which has come from various other places. Regarding Soyinka, right, that tiger doesn't have to celebrate its tigerness. But I think what Soyinka was getting, the point that he was getting to is the fact that there is a tradition, right, in French and Francophone thought, okay? There is a tendency to be very theoretical about things, right? Not enough practical about things, not enough, not pragmatic enough. And what Soyinka was saying that is, just go ahead and write what you have to write. You don't have to be, telling us, this is how this thing goes, and so on and so forth. So, it tended, right, to emphasize, okay, the difference that some people perceive between, the African who lives in the former British colonies, and those who live in the former French colonies. I don't see that much of it.
More questions?
Yes.
So I'm trying to link the citizenship, language, and creation. And we took the period post-independence. So when we speak about the breaking of the semanticity of the language, here we have a set of people who have just, got their independence from a system which believed in complete assimilation. And then these people eventually decide to write about issues that concern their realities. It's true that a lot of this breaking of semanticity would have been conscious, but wasn't it a very inevitable of the whole, situation that we found ourselves in?
It should be an inevitable consequence. It should be an inevitable consequence because it's just natural. That in fact there is, there is in linguistics, okay, there is this criteria of pertinence, right? That is that, if I come to you and tell you that, there is snow outside, okay? If I tell you right now that there is snow outside, it would be difficult for you to take this statement and link it to the situation outside. So, the statement is not pertinent to the reality. For language to be truthful, right, it has to be pertinent, in fact, to the very situation in which you are. Right? When after independence, right, in the post-colonial, one of the basic concerns of the writers were to redefine themselves, to redefine their own identity. There is no better way of redefining your own identity, no better way than using, in fact, language. And this would be done, in fact, in the language of the former colonizer. But this former colonizer no more does not have any power anymore. So this process of change, this process of modification, in fact, of the language, right, is something that should have been perceived as something that is not only natural, but that is simply normal. But what you come up against, okay, you come up against, in fact, like a kind of rigidity, okay, that had been cultivated for years, for decades and decades, in fact, through schools and stuff. So they have to deal with that, right? And I think that this positioning of Senghor and the subsequent opposition that he received from other writers allowed for a space where people realized, in fact, that in fact it was no longer possible to have this rigid position. Right? Because they basically are Africans and they are not French, so they speak French differently. Right? It should have been, right? Not surprising that it was not.